Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar Mary Anning and Other Inspiring Female Geoscientists. My name is Eva Hartai. I will lead the session today. I am a geologist and an honorary professor at University of Miskolc, Hungary, with 45 years of teaching experience. Recently, I am the coordinator of the ENGIE project. I would like to inform you that the webinar will be recorded and the recording will be uploaded to the ENGIE YouTube channel. I would also like to invite you to submit questions to the speakers using the Q&A function in Zoom. The questions will be answered after the two presentations. First, I would like to tell you a few words about the ENGIE project. First, I will share my screen. ENGIE, the complete name is Encouraging Girls to Study Geosciences and Engineering. This is a 3 years long EU-funded project. It will end at the end of this year in December, and the consortium includes 25 partners from 21 European countries. The aim of the project is to raise the interest of young girls, especially young people in general, and especially young girls, to study geosciences and the related engineering disciplines. And this way, we would like to improve the gender balance in these professions. We organize, how do we do that? We organize actions in these 21 European countries in a harmonized way. And these actions include field trips, science club events, webinars, workshops, video contest, photo contest. We created videos about the ENGIE role models, and we link ENGIE to other initiations like Girls' Day, University Open Day, Researchers' Night, and lots of kinds of other activities. We also created a methodology course for science teachers in order to help them teach geosciences in an attractive and engaging way. So far, we have reached more than 800,000 people from all over Europe. And I hope that thanks to our project, not only the gender balance will improve, but more and more young people will get familiar with the Earth processes and the human impact on our planet. And this will help them in developing a responsible thinking when they become adult citizens. So that's all very shortly about ENGIE. And now back to the webinar. Our webinar today will be devoted to women geoscientists who challenged the social conventions at their times and significantly contributed to geoscience. We invited the authors of the GEAS, so-called GEAS booklet. Later it will be explained what it means, the GEAS booklet, and the author of another book about Mary Anning. First, I would like to introduce Rosa María Mateos, who will present the GEAS booklet. Rosa has PhD in geology from the Complutense University of Madrid. Currently, she is the head of the Department of Natural Hazards at the Geological Survey of Spain and the deputy chair of the Earth Observation Expert Group of the Eurogeo surveys. As a geologist, she deals with landslides. As a writer, She is an inveterate storyteller, although currently she has turned to short novels. Rosa is also a great science communicator. She is the author of numerous books and magazine articles related to geology. Rosa, the floor is yours.
Many, many thanks, Eve. I'm going to share my screen. It's okay? Okay. Nice to meet you and good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, I would like to thank the European Federation of Geologists for organizing this meeting. And many, many thanks to the ENGIE project that has given visibility to GEAS across the world. So thank you, Anita, and thank you, Eve. And I'm going to speak about GEAS, women who study the earth. I don't know what happened. Okay. GEAS is an illustrated book which was originally written in Spanish, written and edited in Spanish. And this book travels through time to give voice to 12 women geologists of different times. We did here GEAS to make all those women more visible and rescuing them from that forgotten place where history placed them. I suppose that most of us, we have studied geology without their names. I would like to briefly introduce the three authors of the original version of GEAS. I begin with the illustrator. She's Nívola Uyá. She lives in Mallorca, and she has an important work as an illustrator of children's histories. My colleague Ana Ruíz, she works at the Geological Survey of Spain in geophysics, in the field of geophysics. And Ana is also on the management team of the Spanish Geological Society. And myself, I am also a geologist and a part-time writer. Who are GEAS? We select 12 valuable and brave women of different times, historical contexts, areas of expertise, and nationalities. But all of them have something in common. They made an indelible mark on the knowledge, on the geological knowledge. Here you have the list of the 12 women selected. And we start with Mary Anning in the beginning of the 19th century. And we finish with Catherine Sullivan, dancing in the space with her. And Catherine Sullivan is the only GEAS still alive today. The first one is the British Mary Anning, that you know perfectly that she's the mother of the paleontology and the fossil woman, as Tom Sharp is going to tell us. And we title Mary Anning as an unusual life carved in stone. I think that Tom is going to tell us more about Mary Anning in detail. The second one is Florence Bascom. She was from USA. She was expert on petrology and a very good teacher. and she did remarkable advance in the fields of crystallography, mineralogy, and petrology. And she was the first woman working in the United States Geological Survey. In fact, I think that Florence Bascom shattered the glass ceiling during her time. The geology that led the way. The next one is Inge Lehmann. I think that most of us knows Inge Lehmann. She was born in Denmark, and she was expert on geophysics and seismology, and she defined the structure of the Earth's core. All of us have studied the Lehmann discontinuity that separates the liquid outer core and the solid inner core, the bedding of the Earth's solid heart. Marguerite Thomas Williams was born in USA. She was an expert on sedimentology and geomorphology also, and she was the first African-American person, male and female, to receive a doctorate in geology. And it was when the rights of the African-American population were not yet recognized. She had a dream. Dorothy Hill was born in Australia, and she was a very good paleontologist, and is the GEAS horsewoman and adventurer. She was the Amazon of the coral seas. And she was the first female professor at an Australian university and the first female president of the Australian Academy of Science. In fact, there are very, very few geologists in history that have received as many distinctions as Dorothy Hill. Mary Leakey, the British Mary Leakey, is my favorite because she did in 1978 one of the greatest discoveries in science. She discovered the Laetoli footprints in Africa that were the first human footsteps, the trail of that curious monkey that go down from the trees to walk upright on the earth. The sun is the size of a human foot. Marietta West from USA, she was expert on planetary geology, and she not only studied but also selected the exact location on the moon in which the first astronaut placed his feet in 1969. It was a small step for female geologists, but a great leap for humanity. The moon at our feet. Mary Tharp from USA. I think that everybody knows Mary Tharp because she made the ocean floor and the mid-Atlantic ride and gave credibility to the continental drift theory. Mary Tharp gave light and color to the 70% of our planet, shining a light on the ocean floor. Carmina Virgili, she's Spanish, and she was not only a very good geologist, but also a politician. As geologist, she studied the Permian-Triassic extinction, but she was a great politician because she was the Secretary of State for University and Research during an important period in Spain that was the Spanish democratic transition. So, a steady path to democracy. La Catacampa from Mexico, she was expert on engineering geology, but she was also a very great politician because La Catacampa revolutionized the public's view of geology in Mexico. She defended the rights of the general public to benefit from the subsoil riches, not only groundwater, but also raw material. Geology and revolution. Katia Kraf from France, she was an expert on volcanology and georisk, and with her husband Maurice, they work on volcanic risks and they develop early warning system in many volcanoes. Unfortunately, they died by the superheated gases during the Mount Hunsen eruption in Japan in 1991. Currently, nowadays, there is in all the cinemas a film, Fire of Love, with the history of Katia Kraf and Maurice. So I invite you to see this film. Life and death at the age of the volcano. And finally, Catherine Dywers-Sullivan from USA. She was expert on marine and planetary geology. And very, very young, at the age of 33 in 1984, she made history because she was the first woman to walk in space. And 2 years ago, in 2020, Catherine Sullivan became the first woman to reach the Challenger Deep, which is the deepest point on Earth, our walk in space. I would like to say that fortunately, GEAS coincide with the ENGIE project. And thanks to ENGIE, currently, ENGIE makes GEAS available online and free. You can click on this link and you can see the different versions of GEAS in different languages. In Bulgarian, in Czech, in Croatian, English, Greek, Italian, Spanish, and Turkish. And I think Anita will say, but it's coming soon, new versions in Basque, Catalan, and Galician, which are official languages here in Spain. It's ready the Portuguese, Russian, and Swedish version, and perhaps GEAS is going to be translated to Chinese. So here you can see the different front pages of this translation of GEAS. We have 15 versions of the book. So I invite all the people to click on this link and to visit the web page of the ENGIE project, where all the versions of GEAS are available. And many, many thanks for your attention. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa, for introducing this amazing booklet. It's really impressive. As I mentioned before, questions will be asked, can be submitted through the Q&A function, and the questions will be answered after the second presentation. And now, let me introduce you Tom Sharp. Tom was curator of paleontology and archives at the National Museum of Wales for more years than he cares to remember. He also taught geology classes in the lifelong learning departments of the universities of Cardiff and Bristol, and has guided field trips to many parts of the world, particularly the polar regions. He has long had an interest in the history of geology, especially the history of the discovery of fossil marine reptiles, the history of early geological mapping, and the history of the geological study of Antarctica. He now lives in Scotland. His biography about Mary Anning was published in 2020 with a paperback edition in 2021. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you to the European Federation for the invitation to speak to you today. It's wonderful to have this opportunity. And I want to talk to you, of course, about Mary Anning. She's perhaps the most remarkable and famous female geologist of the 19th century, and perhaps of all time, Mary Anning. She lived during the first half of the 19th century when geology and paleontology in particular were developing rapidly as a new science. And she lived in a place where the local cliffs were eroding rapidly and were full of fossils. You can see in this famous portrait of her, the coastline behind her. And she lived in a spot where there's wonderful exposure of rocks, rich in fossils. Mary Anning was very much the right person in the right place at the right time. And she became the most famous fossil collector of her day. Mary Anning was born, lived and died in the small town of Lyme Regis on the south coast of England. It's about 240 kilometres to the southwest of London. And it's situated at the southern end of an outcrop of Jurassic rocks, which extends from northeast to southwest across England. And these Jurassic rocks, limestones and mudstones deposited under the sea about 200 million years ago, are exposed in the cliffs along the coast at Lyme Regis. Every little circle you can see in the foreground here on this foreshore platform is a large ammonite. Some of the rocks are mudstones, like these to the east of Lyme Regis. These are very soft and they erode easily. And this, in fact, is the site of one of the largest landslips in Europe. And especially in stormy weather, the soft rocks are readily eroded. And this was Mary Anning's favourite time to come out to look for fossils, was after a storm, which would have brought down new rocks and exposed new fossils. Well, this is what Lyme Regis looked like at about the time that Mary Anning was alive. It was a small town situated within a narrow river valley on its steep valley sides. It was an important port with a busy harbour that was protected by a breakwater called the Cobb. About 20 years before Mary Anning was born, Lyme Regis became a popular tourist resort with people coming to enjoy the new pastime, the new hobby of swimming in the sea bathing. And these tourists wanted to take souvenirs home with them. So local people sold them what were known as curios or curiosities. And they had names like ladies' fingers and verteberries, crocodile jaws and cornu ammonices. And these were found on the beaches and in rocks and sold by the locals to the tourists. These were, of course, fossils, belemnites and ammonites, fossil fish like Dipedium down in the bottom left of your screen there, and the jaws and vertebrae of marine reptiles like ichthyosaurs. Well, one of the first collectors and sellers of fossils at Lyme Regis was a carpenter called Richard Anning. And he taught two of his children, Joseph and Mary, how to collect fossils. And this is an imaginary scene from 1869. We have no idea what Mary Anning looked like as a child or what her father, Richard, looked like. But they lived in this house from about 1808 to 1826. And they sold their fossils from a table in front of their cellar door. Well, in 1810, Richard Anning died of tuberculosis, and the family were in some considerable debt. But Mary Anning's mother, also called Mary Anning, confusingly, continued the fossil business, selling fossils from the shop, and it became known, certainly from 1813, as Mrs. Anning's Curiosity Shop in Lyme Regis. And that's where Mary Anning and her mother and brother sold their fossils to visitors. Now, interested fossils had been stimulated by the discovery of a large skull, which was thought to be of a fossil crocodile in the autumn of 1811, and the recovery of other parts of the skeleton in November 1812. And this is the discovery that's popularly attributed to the young Mary Anning, as in this sketch from 1925, with a very posh and middle-class looking Mary Anning. She looked nothing like that, I'm sure. But the skull was in fact found by her brother, Joseph, in the autumn of 1811, and the rest of the skeleton, about 17 feet length of vertebrae, and some limbs and some ribs, and a few of the upper limb bones of the front paddle were discovered and recovered by Mary Anning at the same site a year later in November 1812. And we know this from the reports in the newspapers of the time. In November 1812, it mentions a complete crocodile was discovered in a very perfect state. In fact, it was far from complete, and it turned out, of course, not to be a crocodile, but something completely new to science. When the Annings sold it to a local collector who'd been very kind to them and buying specimens from them after Richard Anning's death as well, and giving them gifts of money. And he gave the specimen to a new private natural history museum, which had just opened in London. And there it was on display for a few years until in 1819, William Bullock, whose museum it was, sold his entire collection off at auction, and the Anning specimen was bought by the British Museum. And they paid twice as much as the Annings had been paid for it. They paid £47, 5 shillings. So in the space of 7 years, this specimen had gone from the Annings to Henley, to Bullock, to the British Museum. So it's not surprising that the connection with its finders, a couple of children, was lost. And that specimen is still there in the Natural History Museum in London today, but its association with the Annings lay unrecognised for 150 years. Well, the Annings found several more skulls in 1813 and a complete specimen in 1818, the first to show that this animal had 4 limbs. And it was also in this year of 1818 that the animal was given its name of Ichthyosaurus. Well, at the time, there were 3 geologists with particularly strong associations with Lyme Regis. There was William Buckland, who was effectively the first professor of geology at Oxford University, and he became Mary Anning's leading supporter. And he was usually the first person that she told of her discoveries. Henry de la Beach, who moved to Lyme Regis in 1812, he was the same age as Mary's brother and a fossil collector himself, and he often went out collecting fossils with Mary Anning. He later founded the British Geological Survey. And William Conybeare, he had family connections to the area and was a friend of William Buckland's from Oxford. Well, in 1823, Mary Anning found the first complete plesiosaurus, another marine reptile. It had been named in 1821 from partial material, not a complete specimen, until this one was discovered by Mary in December 1823. And this was the first to show this unusual long neck and very small skull. And Mary knew it was special. She told one of her clients that it was the first and only one discovered in Europe. In Paris, though, Georges Cuvier, the greatest comparative anatomist of the time, had doubts that the long neck was real. No living animal had a neck like that. But he was soon reassured by Buckland and Conybeare and others that it was in fact genuine. The specimen was transported by ship from Lyme Regis to London, and it was exhibited at the Geological Society in London and discussed at a meeting in February 1824, and a paper was written by William Conybeare and published about it in 1824. It had been bought by a wealthy collector, the Duke of Buckingham, and it eventually found its way after his death in 1848 into the Natural History Museum in London. Well, this discovery and Cugier's acceptance of it established Mary Anning's reputation as a fossil dealer and collector, and she was famous. Her discoveries were reported widely in the newspapers around Great Britain. She went on to discover other plesiosaurs like this complete one in 1829, and this one in 1830, a new species, probably a new genus in fact, which she recognized as a juvenile. She found many more ichthyosaurs and included this huge one, which Mary found the skull of in 1832, sold it to a collector, and this collector then organized the excavation of the rest of the skeleton. And it's now in the Natural History Museum in London, where it's displayed above the skull found by Mary Anning's brother in 1811. In 1828, she found the first pterosaur identified in Britain, and she found lots of fossil fish like Dipedium and Squaloria, which is a kind of shark. She recognized that as being a completely new kind of fish, completely new to science, and she marketed it as that, although it took her a few years to find a seller for it, a buyer for it. But she also collected other fossil animals, not just the backboned animals, not just the vertebrates, but invertebrates like this brittle star, the starfish that you can see in the bottom right. She collected crinoids like Pentocrinites and this sea urchin relative, and she noticed it was always associated with driftwood. And this led William Buckland to conclude that it lived attached to floating driftwood. It was not attached to the sea floor as it had been previously thought. She realized that some squid fossils preserved their ink sacs and that this dry ink could be reconstituted and used as sepia drawing ink. And this drawing of an ichthyosaur skull, a specimen found by Mary Anning, was done in fossil sepia by Mary's friend and fellow fossil collector, Elizabeth Philpott. And Mary recognized that some curious stones found in the rocks were the fossilized droppings of fish and ichthyosaurs, and William Buckland invented the term coprolite for these. In 1829, Henry de la Beach and William Buckland put together this drawing of all the animals known from the Jurassic rocks of Lyme Regis, many of them Mary Anning's discoveries, and shows them eating each other and producing coprolites. So the plesiosaur in the center having its neck bitten by the large ichthyosaur is having a shock with its coprolites being produced from its bottom end there. We've got the pterosaurs flying through the air and several different kinds of different species of ichthyosaurs shown in this scene. Henry de la Beach had prints made and sold, and the proceeds were given to Mary Anning. She also sold them from her shop in Lyme Regis. And this was the first ever reconstruction of its type, the first ever reconstruction of a whole ecosystem of a time from the past. And it's the antecedent of everything which comes afterwards, right up to the modern computerized animations that you see on film and television today. And they become common in books about fossils soon after this. This is one just a few years later in 1834, showing these nightmare scenes of sea monsters biting and picking each other's eyes out, based on Mary Anning's discoveries. Well, her discoveries and her fame brought many of the leading geologists of the time to Lyme Regis to meet her and to go fossil hunting with her. George Greenough, Adam Sedgwick from Cambridge, Isle, Roderick Murchison, Gideon Mantell and Richard Owen, as well as collectors like Thomas Hawkins, Thomas Allen, Sir Philip Edgerton, and clients of the times. Thomas Allen had a wonderful quote, said that Mary Anning, the geologist of this place, is a very interesting person. Her knowledge of the subject is quite surprising. She's perfectly acquainted with the anatomy of her fossils, and her account of her disputes with Buckland, whose anatomical science she holds in great contempt, was quite amusing. So we've got this largely self-educated working class woman arguing about fossil anatomy with the professor of geology from the University of Oxford. She was truly remarkable. From France came Dufresnoy, Bruchon de Villiers, Constan Prevost, Elie de Beaumont. From the United States, George Featherstone Hall. From Prussia, Ludwig Leichhardt. From Switzerland, Louis Agassiz. And from Saxony, Carl Gustav Kehres. They all came to find Mary Anning and have a look at her shop and her fossils. Gustav Kehres met her in 1844 and had her write her name in his pocketbook. And she said, as she handed it back, "I am well known throughout the whole of Europe." And indeed she was. Leopold von Buch had given a lecture about Mary Anning and her discoveries in Berlin in 1831, saying she's a knowledgeable lady who's become renowned on the continent for her discoveries. And in the United States, as well as being known in scientific circles, this is a children's book published in 1840, which recommends that no one should go to Lyme Regis without visiting Mary Anning and her collection. This is the shop where she lived in later part of her life, and that recommendation in the New York book of visiting her collection would have been housed in this little cottage behind the young lad on the ladder there. This little tiny building was her shop and her home from 1826 to 1847. Well, many of Mary Anning's discoveries were described at meetings of the Geological Society of London. Founded in 1807, this was a society for gentlemen. It was not for working men, but wealthy gentlemen, and it was certainly not for women. Mary Anning could not be a member, not only because she was a woman, but she couldn't have afforded the subscription, and she lived far from London. And there were many other women fossil collectors and geologists who were excluded from membership or attending those meetings. Most of them, unlike Mary Anning, were wealthy, middle class, or even aristocracy. Even the wives of some of the geologists like Mary Buckland and Charlotte Murchison, who were knowledgeable fossil collectors and illustrators in their own right, couldn't attend. Now, the Geological Society was not unique. Many scientific societies of the time did not permit women, and society as a whole at that time regarded women as second-class citizens. So they were dismissing 50% of the population. In 1829, a geologist called George Cumberland wrote that we ought to remember that the world would have remained ignorant of the fossils of Lyme Regis but for the patient labours of 3 female pioneers, Mary Anning, Miss Congreve and Miss Philpotts. They and a few others are entitled to a full share of the honours. It was often said that Mary Anning was never credited with her discoveries other than in newspaper reports. And there is little mention in the scientific literature of the Annings in the first half of the 1820s. But after 1824, when Mary Anning had become well known after her discovery of the complete plesiosaur, then she's almost always credited in the scientific papers describing her fossils. But by the end of the 1820s, she was expressing feelings of frustration and resentment that perhaps she had not done as well out of her finds as she might once have hoped. In 1831, she told a friend that she thought the men of learning had sucked her brains and used her discoveries to their advantage. Mary Anning's discoveries had brought her fame, but they did not bring her fortune. She had certainly many disadvantages. First of all, of course, she was a woman, and for that simple reason could not fully participate in science. She was a working class woman, which limited the circles in which she could move, although she counted both working class people and aristocracy amongst her friends. She was poor for much of her life. She never really had much money. Her fortunes fluctuated depending on what she had found and sold. And she was a spinster, an unmarried woman, and that carried a certain amount of social stigma at that time in the early 19th century. She had a limited education, just a couple of years at school, and she was provincial. She was away from the scientific debates that were taking place in London. But she had a number of advantages. She was intellectually gifted. She was an extraordinarily bright woman. There are many comments from visitors about her intelligence. She was a knowledgeable and respected professional character. And being unmarried, she was independent. She could do whatever she liked, and anything she owned was hers. Had she been married, everything she possessed would have belonged to her husband. And she had the advantage of being self-educated. Although her education was limited, she taught herself what she knew about fossils, other than what she had gained from her father, taking her out into the field. She had the advantage too of locale, being in the right place where fossils were coming out of rapidly eroding rocks. And from her friends, her letters, her comments from visitors, we have a picture of a woman who is confident, competent, articulate, charismatic, proud, pious, generous, and kind. But also we have a woman who is conceited and opinionated, resentful and gossiping and blunt and indiscreet and unafraid of causing offense. You know, she's human. And through her intelligence, her wit, her determination, her skills, her experience and expertise, she established the business of a professional fossil dealer, finding, preparing and selling fossils to museums and scientists. She overcame huge odds as a working class woman, pioneering a career never before seen in Lyme Regis or indeed anywhere, and working in wet, dirty and dangerous conditions. Well, Mary Anning died of cancer at the age of 47. She was buried in the churchyard in Lyme Regis in a family plot shared with some of her nephews and later that of her brother. Her old friend Henry de la Beach read her obituary at a meeting of the Geological Society, a remarkable tribute for a woman, someone who wasn't a member and couldn't be a member because she was a woman. And her Geological Society friends installed a window in her memory in the church, very close to her grave. And she's now remembered by this wonderful new statue on the cliffs at Lyme Regis, which was unveiled just 6 months ago, showing Mary with her hammer, her basket, and her dog heading for the cliffs to collect some fossils. Her story was told and retold in the years of her death, such as in this children's magazine of 1869, and in this novel, the first children's novel about Mary Anning from 1925, it was written in the 1890s, before the 1890s. And since the 1970s especially, there have been dozens of books about her, especially books for children. In fact, there's been more written about Mary Anning than about any other geologist, apart from Charles Darwin. It includes my recent addition to the pile. Well, in my new biography of Mary Anning, I tried as much as possible to go back to original and contemporary sources rather than relying on secondary literature, which can be contradictory or ambiguous or just plain wrong. However, even contemporary reports can be accurate and misleading, and original archival history was scarce and hard to find. Most of Mary Anning's papers, books and correspondence have been dispersed and lost, although some do exist in the Natural History Museum. But sometimes, unexpectedly, previously unknown material will suddenly appear. In August 2020, just as I was finishing off my book, an 1830 letter from Mary Anning to William Buckland appeared at auction in London by a private collector. No one knew about the existence of this letter before. Such is Mary Anning's fame today that the letter sold for 10 times its auction estimate. Someone somewhere paid over £100,000 for it. And in case you're wondering, it wasn't me. But regardless of the monetary value of Mary Anning's letters or of her fossils, her life and her work was pioneering, breaking new ground, not just as a woman paleontologist, but as the first professional paleontologist. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for this very impressive and excellent, beautifully illustrated presentation. Now it's time to answer the questions. I received a few questions. First, I would ask Rosa, although you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, but would you explain shortly what does GEAS mean?
Okay, GEAS is a title for the book, means women in geology. In Spanish is GEAS. You know that GEAS was the good of the earth. So we
So
want
it is
to...
not an acronym.
No, it's not an acronym. Yes.
Yeah.
It was poetical title for these 12 women. So there is not an acronym now. Women who study the earth, nothing else. Thank you.
Another question, Tom could answer that. What would Mary Anning say to young female teenagers interested in sciences, geology, nature?
What an interesting,
it's a tricky question.
what an interesting question. I think she would say, go out there and get on with it. Be determined. Don't let any obstacles get in your way. There were many obstacles placed in Mary Anning's way. It was a dangerous occupation. She nearly died on perhaps half a dozen occasions, as well as times when she nearly was killed as a child by lightning and also by drowning, nearly drowning. And the social barriers that were put in her way, many of them don't exist in many countries today, but they still do in some form or another. And there are attitudes, I think, towards women in science, which are hangovers from the 19th century, which are still found in some quarters today. So I think she would say, be determined and get on with it.
Perfect. Very good advice. And another tricky question for Rosa. Whom would you nominate for the next series of GEAS women? I mean, do you know, for example, from the current female geoscientists, do you have
Yes.
any idea who could
We
also
are
be
thinking to write a second version because GEAS could be infinite, no? But we are aware that are many women geologists, very important with very good contributions. And I think that GEAS is an open project. Sure that there will be a second, a third, or a fifth version of GEAS. And I think that most of them are in the 20th and the 21st century. So we have to update GEAS in the future, sure.
And there is a question for both of you. The question is, which personal qualities should an aspiring female geoscientist have in particular? Based on your work or based on your experiences while you were working on this book or booklet. But if you do not want to...
Well, I mean, I'm not sure how appropriate it is for me as a man to make this suggestion, but I mean, again, I would come back to determination.
Yeah.
I think being firm in what you want to do and going out there and doing it, I think is important. But Rosa, I'm sure.
And I think that they are women that believe and love what they do. I think that this is the key, that you love what you do. And they are very brave women, very independent also. As Tom Sharp says about Mary Anning, she was independent. But I think that they love their profession It is very, very important.
Yeah.
And defend their profession.
Thank you very much. And I think that soon we will arrive at the end of our session. I would like to inform the audience again that the webinar, the recording of the webinar will be uploaded and will be available on the ENGIE YouTube channel. But before you leave, please fill out the short questionnaire at the link that is shared in the chat box. Anita, I'm just checking if you shared the link. Yes, this is the short poll at Slido. Rosa and Tom, you can also.
Ah, yes, we also. Okay. Perfect.
It's
Todos.
really very short.
Introduce the conic ENGIE.
So now we are really at the end. I would like to thank the speakers for their outstanding presentations. And we learned a lot from them. And I also thank the attendees for joining us. So thank you again. And please,
thank you very much.
Please have a look at the recording on the ENGIE YouTube channel. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.